Hi, I'm Cameron.
And I'm Hayden.
And this is
Until the End of Crime. So, Cameron.
Yes.
I need your help.
No.
I need your guidance.
Stop.
I need your brilliance.
Okay, now you've gone too far.
I need you to help me understand, what do you think the role of traditional media, like television and film and video games, has had on the public's perception of violence?
Violence. V-I-O. What role has violence in the media played?
How has the media, so when we talk about entertainment media like television, film, video games, how does that shape and affect the public's perception of violence?
I don't think that it does as much in 2025, say, as it has in years and decades past. But I know that in like the early 2000s, maybe the late 90s, early 2000s, there was a kind of move towards video games are responsible for violence.
Right.
I think it was a legal defense that was used in some cases, particularly with teens that committed heinous crimes. Although I'm definitely taking like an episode of Law and Order SCU and making that a thing. But most of those episodes are based in some legal case. I just don't know the specific legal case that would be referencing. But I mean, the media, one, that's something that's going to ignite people, because you have people who are gamers who are going to vehemently oppose the idea that video games are violent. And then you've got people who are probably older and don't understand technology so much that are going to be like, video games bad, scary, they make people hurt people.
What about films?
You know, I don't watch those.
What about television?
You know, I do watch that.
I know. You like to watch verbal violence.
Whoa, you like to watch verbal violence.
I sure do. I'll watch any housewife any day. I'll watch any drag race any day. You put it on, I'm watching.
Yeah, yeah, sure. Am I going to go back through highlighted scenes from Untucked from seasons past?
Yes, you are.
Absolutely.
100%.
It is entertaining. Verbal violence.
I don't want you to get caught up on that. Do not get caught up on verbal violence. I am.
Well, I mean, okay, so violence in TV and movies. There are ratings where it is recommended that you be this age or have a parent present if you're not that age or older to watch stuff, because there's a level of brain development and understanding the world around you that is probably required to understand that this is a movie, this is not the way that people are supposed to behave. But some people don't necessarily give a lot of credence to those rating labels, like PG-13. They don't necessarily make sure that their child is either understanding it or is viewing it with parental guidance. I'm not talking about the media, though. I'm just talking about like parents. Mm-hmm. I really think that that's what it boils down to. There are all these perceptions of video games and stuff, but it's similar to what we talked about last week with Mackenzie Sharilla and her mom.
You're about to get the longest message put on our YouTube channel again.
Shout out to whoever this dude is on YouTube. Thanks for commenting. It boosts us in the algorithm.
Please share.
Yeah. Next time, break it up into multiple comments. That's helpful. Did he talk about parenting at all?
You know, he talked about the parenting of Dominic Russo's mother.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just not going to sit here and engage with vilification of a victim.
Right.
Call me crazy. No, but we talked last week about parents, and I think that video games have age labels on them, but I don't necessarily think that parents spend as much time vetting those labels or understanding the type of games that are being played. Because I know that like first-person shooter point of view games, like why are we putting kids in a position to experience that perspective and then not following up, not checking in, not understanding what it is that they're doing, and so on and so forth. So, because a few months ago I was working with a group, and we were doing this research thing about reading, and psychologically, when you read something, your brain is creating the same response that it would if you were experiencing that event.
Mm-hmm.
And so I can't imagine that it's a terribly far leap to think that if you are participating in any sort of first-person video game, that you are not also, in some sense, having that same type of reaction in your brain where you're creating these experiences. And so the more you're exposed to something, the more that you create an experience in your mind, and your brain is wiring itself that way, then the more normal, for lack of a better word, that experience feels, seems, becomes. And so then, yeah, I can see why the media would perpetuate this idea that there is a blurring of the lines between watching video games. I'm 90. Playing video games, particularly that are violent, and especially those where the gamer or gamers in question are perpetuating the violence, where there would, be some media responsibility placed on the video games making somebody be violent. But I don't think it's anywhere near as simple as that. Nothing ever is. Nothing is simple.
Right.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I think you make some really interesting points that weren't necessarily things I had really considered or thought about when I posed this question to you. I think there's a lot of validity in this idea that we create these warnings for parents that largely go unignored. And then to add levels to that issue, we have this idea that nudity is more harmful to children than incredibly violent films. Action movies where killing is common is totally fine for a PG-13. But oh God, more than one breast was shown. That shit's R-rated. That's one facet that I think is really complicated. I think one of the things that you kind of touched on, especially towards the end, was this idea that this kind of inundation by first-person POV shooter games and violent video games and violent media, violent films, is that it's almost kind of desensitizing. And then once that occurs, it's easy for young people, or people even in general, to believe that emulating those kinds of behaviors would be normal.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I want to go shoot someone. Obviously, that's fine. And so I think that also brings up an interesting conversation around the idea of an anti-hero. Think about
It's a good song.
comic book characters and film characters like Deadpool, anti-hero, violent, awful, just kills people, and he still gets to be considered heroic.
Right.
Then we have people like Luigi Mangione, who has been turned into kind of a folk legend, a folk hero.
Yeah.
And the message there is, I think, is anti-heroic as it gets. I don't know, though. It's complex. It's difficult. Like you said, there's nothing ever that's simple. On the morning of Tuesday, March 26th, 1991, a couple walking along an abandoned set of railroad tracks in Middletown, New York, made a horrifying discovery that would mark the beginning of a series of gruesome crimes. At first, the couple thought they had stumbled upon a discarded mannequin lying near the tracks.
It's never a mannequin. It's
just ask Tammy Brown.
It's just never a mannequin. How big is Middletown, New York?
It's about 25,000 people.
25,000. Okay.
But as they moved closer, the grim reality set in. It was the nude and brutally mutilated body of a woman. Just this idea of a nude and brutally mutilated woman takes me back to like video games like Grand Theft Auto, where you can pick up a sex worker and having sex with them in the video game gives you health. And then once you release them from your vehicle, you can attack them and get your money back. Middletown. I hate that it's Middletown. I hate that it's not Middleton. I keep wanting to say Middleton, but it's Middletown.
Yeah.
Middletown was a small city, again, of about 25,000 residents, had long been considered a quiet and safe community. It was known for its flourishing downtown and tight-knit neighborhoods, and the town was not accustomed to violent crime. The discovery of this woman's body shattered the illusion of safety overnight, sending shockwaves through the community and exposing an undercurrent of fear that no one had anticipated. Retired detective Barry Bernstein, who would later recall the scene, described the case as one of the most shocking and violent crimes in the town's history. a discovery that was, quote, unimaginable in its brutality.
When did Grand Theft Auto come out?
So way after this, way after this. I think they still had 8-bit video games at this time. The police arrived at the scene and they were immediately confronted with the extent of the violence inflicted on the victim. The woman had suffered extensive stab wounds and deep lacerations to her face, her neck, her upper chest, and her abdomen. Her facial features had nearly been obliterated, an act that left investigators shaken. And actually, one of the former detectives for the Middletown Police Department recounted how it was as if they had sliced off half of her face.
So a personal attack.
Very personal, it seemed.
Likely somebody who knew the victim.
Detective Mark Bonnell noted that you could tell she had been cut open, explaining how her body had been almost sliced open from her neck to almost her pelvis. They also noted that it looked as if her body had been meticulously washed or cleaned following her murder.
So was there not blood at the scene?
Correct.
So this was a dump. They killed her elsewhere, and so they needed to find the crime scene.
Yes, and not only that, her body had been posed in a very specific position. In fact, the victim's arms were positioned close to her side, and her legs were ever so slightly apart. And Tracy Benjamin, a former LAPD investigator, actually interpreted the pose that the body had been left in as a deliberate attempt to humiliate and shock whoever found her, and to also create more shame around the identity of the woman who was murdered.
By having her arms by her sides and her legs slightly apart?
Yes.
Okay.
They have like really, so I took a lot of this information from Twisted Killers, a docuseries on Peacock, and they had several of the former detectives that worked on the case speaking, as well as different experts that reviewed the forensic evidence. And a really common notion between all of the forensic experts was that so much of what was done to this victim was meant to shame her and humiliate her and create a sense of like increased humiliation with every new layer that was found.
I mean, yeah, it was very clearly rage fueled, specifically at her.
Right.
I can't wait. I love when you bring these experts in and then I don't see eye to eye with the experts, because obviously what I say carries a lot of weight.
Goes. Whatever you say goes.
Not
your way
goes.
Or the highway.
That's not true. That's definitely not true.
The horror of the scene only deepened when the police attempted to locate evidence. Teams scoured the railroad tracks, they searched for tire marks, footprints, or any kind of forensic clue that could help explain how the body was transported and left there. And one of the ways they explained their search for evidence was directly where the body was found, was kind of this origin point where their forces all moved outwards, because it wasn't necessarily a wooded area, but it wasn't a populated area. It just happened to be along railroad tracks. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And so they all fanned out looking for evidence. And of course, none was found. Very, very, very little evidence. And the lack of any kind of significant physical traces and the fact that the body appeared to have been cleaned, again, suggested what you said earlier, which was this person was murdered elsewhere before being moved to this location.
Did you say she was nude?
She was nude.
Did you say that she had any possessions with her? Any belongings?
No possessions, no belongings.
So they're going to have to identify her, which is going to be, I guess, a little bit more difficult if she doesn't have fingerprints on file anywhere because they don't have her face.
Right. As detectives continue to process the crime scene, one detective in particular, Detective Bonnell, noticed a tattoo on the victim's arm. And upon closer inspection, he found that design to be familiar. He couldn't place it, but he knew that he had seen it somewhere. Now, this next part I don't totally understand, but from my gathering at the station, at the police station, Detective Bonnell and others started combing through this file of photographs that they had, looking for any kind of tattoo matchup.
Mm-hmm.
Lo and behold, the tattoo belonged to one of Detective Bonnell's old classmates, 29-year-old Juliana R. Frank. Detective Barry Bernstein also knew Juliana personally and was stunned. The disconnect between the warm, vibrant woman they had once known and the mutilated remains before them was almost too much to process. because Detective Bonnell and Detective Bernstein both discuss how difficult this discovery was for them. Of course, this was recorded at least 2 decades after the crime. Gosh, probably 3. And you hear both of them get choked up as they talk about this being someone that they knew and this kind of disbelief around the crime. No one could figure out or understand why anyone would want to do this, especially to Juliana. An autopsy revealed the full extent of the horror. Juliana had been stabbed more than 40 times. The investigators discovered that she was around 4 to 5 months pregnant at the time of her death. Not only had she been pregnant,
a very dangerous time in a woman's life is when she's pregnant. That's when a lot of homicides are committed against women.
Well, and the horror doesn't stop there. If you remember, I shared with you that she was sliced from the neck almost down to her pelvis, and the fetus had been removed from her body. Dr. Kate Termini, a forensic psychologist, described this as being something that was really indicative of immense rage and passion and even a personal connection to the victim.
And motive.
That was also something that former prosecutor Beth Karras talked about, noting that obliterating someone's face and identity, as well as destroying something that would be part of their legacy, often signals a perpetrator's desire to, quote, destroy who she was. Early theories pointed to a really deeply personal motive. Overkill of this magnitude, which overkill is the name of this episode, not our podcast episode, but the Twisted Killers episode.
Turns out this podcast is not called Overkill.
Overkill of this magnitude often implies that the murderer had a close emotional tie to the victim. Police speculated that the perpetrator might be an ex-partner or possibly the father of Juliana's unborn child. However, again, with no physical evidence or eyewitness accounts emerging to corroborate this theory, investigators interviewed family members, friends, and anyone else who could maybe shed some kind of light on connections to Juliana.
Could I introduce another potential person of interest to
I would
look
love
for?
that.
So when you talk about ex-partners, if they have a new partner and if the ex-partner is maybe the father of this child, even though Juliana and the father may not be together, it could also be a new partner of her ex-partner.
Yeah, okay. A new partner of her ex-partner who's mad that she's pregnant.
Well, if the ex-partner is the father of the baby and he has a new partner,
right,
that baby poses a threat to their life because now he is tied to Juliana forever, but minimum 18 years.
Right. Yes, absolutely. That is not a thought I had considered, but I can definitely see how that's something that could occur.
All right. Well, in my personal investigation, I guess I'm going to rule that out because you know the case. So not that. Okay. Taking notes in my detective notebook over here.
Yeah, you need to sharpen your pencil.
Excuse me, I'm using a flare pen.
The case took a troubling turn, like it hasn't been troubling this whole time. Look at me minimizing the rest of the case so far.
Face obliterated, fetus removed.
You know what's crazy is that
sternum to pelvis.
At that age, so at 4 to 5 months of development of a fetus, we're talking about something between the size of an avocado and a banana and weighing up to 1 pound. And so it wasn't like they were just removing a blastula or a bean or a blueberry, but something that would have really, at 4 months, the uterus starts to develop in female fetuses. Fingernails, facial features, all of those things are developing in a fetus. And so, well, it's so wild to me, and this is something you never learn throughout the duration of my case or throughout the resources I looked through. I have no idea what happens to the fetus. I don't know what he did with it. I don't know how he disposed of it.
He not. Well, whoa.
Whoa.
I was going to say not the new partner of an ex-lover, but I'm not ruling that out.
We have no idea. You have no idea. I know. You don't know.
I'm saying that the new partner could be
a man.
Right.
Yeah.
So
a pole smoker.
And yet And yet you said that that was not a theory that you had considered. So I still don't have it on my, I've got it crossed
get
out
out
in
your
my
flare
notebook.
pen.
Ow, it stays out.
When a 17-year-old named Angela Cologne came forward with a shocking claim. Angela alleged that she had witnessed Juliana's murder the day before her body was discovered. And according to Angela, her friend Hector had become violent with Juliana and that he had stabbed her several times before rolling her body in a carpet. Angela also alleged that at this murder scene that she was evidently privy to.
No.
What are we knowing about?
Stabbed her a few times and then rolled her in a carpet.
Stabbed her several times.
And then rolled her in a carpet. What details did they hold back? Did they hold back that her face had been mutilated? Did they hold back that the fetus had been stripped from her body, ripped from her body? Because stabbed several times. So sorry, a few and several, major difference there. Stabbed several times is probably not, if I'm giving a witness statement to a murder that was so violent and so...
More than 40 stabs, actually. Designed
to disfigure her and to strip her of her unborn child. I'm probably not just saying, oh, just a few little stabby stabs and then rolled up in a carpet. That's not what I'm relaying to the police if I witnessed this murder.
Well, I guess to Angela's credit, she does go on to describe that there was insane blood spatter at the scene of the crime, that the stabbing had led to blood everywhere. Now, I'm not for sure on the details about whether or not from what I remember, she discussed him cleaning up the mess in his apartment, that he had killed her there and then cleaned it up, or wherever his domicile was.
And who was this person to Angela?
So it seems, I didn't really write down their relationship in my case. So it seems like Angela and Hector and Juliana were connected socially, even though Angela was 17 and Juliana was 29.
Yeah.
And then I'm not sure what Hector's age was. It seemed like they kind of ran in the same circles from what I read and from what I watched. It seems that I know they at least drank together, potentially more than that together, but I can't say that with certainty.
Well, it wasn't Hector.
Desperate?
Based on Angela's statement and also you not knowing his age.
Desperate for any direction. Police. Police. The police. Okay. Okay, calm down, poster child for ADHD.
Look, I'm doing great today compared to the other day.
Yeah, that was a mess. I hate it when the truth hurts.
So does Lizzo.
Desperate for any direction, the police pursued Angela's lead and obtained a search warrant for Hector's apartment, anticipating that they might uncover this blood evidence, this crazy amount of blood spatter that Angela had shared with them, or at least other proof of the crime. However, this search yielded no evidence.
Yeah, it turns out the luminol only lit up on the bed.
No blood spatter, no signs of a struggle, and no indications that Hector had any connection to Juliana's murder.
I told you it wasn't Hector.
So police did bring Hector in. So despite not finding anything in his apartment, he was brought in. He waived his Miranda rights, said, "Oh no, I don't need an attorney." They questioned him.
I didn't do this. I don't need an attorney.
I didn't do this. What's weird is that Detective Bernstein talks about how he essentially knew that Hector was innocent when Hector threw his hands up and he was like, God, like help them understand that I did not kill her. And I'm like, okay, well, anyone can act.
Well, yeah,
not anyone can act well, but
because typically in a case where there's this much stabbing and cutting going on, there are defensive wounds and or their hand slips on the blood and then they get cut themselves. And so he saw in his hands and arms at that point that there were no injuries to them. So he's likely not the perp.
See, and that's when your ADHD is a superpower.
Why? What?
Because you just explored a thought that I hadn't.
I'm going to probably blow your mind hole right now, but I think I explore a lot of thoughts that you have.
Well, I meant like I've spent so much time with this case between watching episodes about it, reading fucking 6 different New York Times articles about it from 1992, and things I had not considered. Not to say that you don't regularly have thoughts that I don't have. Not that we're not two completely different people
Quite.
who have very different tastes and preferences and different ways of viewing the world.
Oh, tastes and preferences. I don't know why that's being brought up right now, but okay.
Well, I just mean there is such variation between us. Obviously, we would have the same thoughts, and that is not for me to also say that I was insinuating that I was smarter or more capable or a better thinker than you. I do not want you or the listeners to think that I'm that pompous and arrogant.
Absolutely not.
At least not today. I don't even feel good today. So he says, "No, God, help them understand. I did not kill her." And he agreed to have a polygraph, and he passed the polygraph. From what they could ascertain, all of it was true. And now at this point, they had nothing they could keep him on.
They wouldn't have anything to keep him on if he did not do well on a polygraph, because it's not admissible in court, because it's garbage. Did she have any defensive wounds?
I don't know that for sure.
Okay, you didn't study the autopsy report yourself?
No, they kept showing the body in the episode, and it was really starting to gross me out. And I was like, I don't want to see the body anymore. You can stop. And they actually, I haven't seen a whole lot of like docuseries that show actual footage of the crime scene. Usually it's dramatized or constructed, but they shared a lot of photographs of the actual crime scene and the bodies. And I was like, that's enough. That's enough. That is enough.
Not bodies.
Oh, the bodies. Bodies. Eventually. So
Hector passed,
yes,
quote unquote, the polygraph.
At this point, Middletown PD is like, shit, this is obviously not our guy. We can't keep him. We've got to talk to Angela again and see if there's something that we missed or if she was dishonest.
Yeah, maybe check her like mental health history.
Well, and again, she's 17, under pressure.
So the right age for what diagnosis? I'm just
being a dumb teenager. They make up
you
shit
You sound like
all
me
the time.
right now.
Listen, I love teenagers. I love young adults. I love helping them. I think that my life's purpose is to help young people. And with that being said, they also do some dumbass shit. And lying about a murder, I mean,
is on the list.
Oh, yeah. So under pressure, Angela admitted that her story was entirely fabricated. She says Angela explained that she felt that she had to provide some level of information and that she had to name a suspect, otherwise the detectives would not leave her alone. She felt like she needed to give them what they wanted.
How did she end up in conversation with detectives about this?
Well, because, again, remember, they started to look for any kind of connections and interviewing friends, family, anyone with a known connection to her.
So she thought, I'm the only one that they're talking to, so I better tell them something.
Again, 17. Also hanging out with a 29-year-old. Also drinking. That's probably not the extent of everything that was going on, but I can't say that for sure. With Hector exonerated and with no new leads, investigators were back to square one. Again, they knew nothing more than the condition of Juliana's body and that she had been murdered. The lack of forensic evidence, coupled with the era's limited DNA analysis capabilities, detectives were left with very few options. As the investigation stalled, the community gathered to mourn Juliana at her funeral, held just 3 days after her body was found. The service drew a large crowd of friends, family members, and neighbors, all united in grief and disbelief. Also, Juliana's sister-in-law, Tony, she was married to Juliana's brother. It was so sad to hear her, and I want to iterate this correctly. As she was being interviewed and providing answers for this docuseries, when confronted with the idea of Juliana's funeral, it really upset me because it wasn't something that she was necessarily sad about, but she talked about the voyeuristic nature of people coming to Juliana's funeral and just wanting to be a part of this gruesome killing experience. And
the same thing that would in part probably motivate a 17-year-old or anybody to try to insert themselves in the case in some way. That is a tale as old as time, because as members of society throughout history, we've always been intrigued, and I don't know, it's very macabre, but like, we enjoy crime until the end of crime splayed right behind you. So yeah, I mean, it's got to be really difficult when you are, because I am fortunate to not know this experience firsthand, but when you have a family member who has died at the hands of somebody else and it becomes a spectacle for other people, that's got to be very difficult.
Grieving someone who dies of natural causes is hard.
Mm-hmm.
Grieving someone who's died at the hands of another, I'm sure, is unimaginable. Doing that while people are participating in this kind of true crime voyeurism in a way that is so personal and so close and so near to the actual physical presence of the body,
Mm-hmm.
of the family, is sickening.
Yeah, when you're showing up to a place that you think is going to be a collective grieving of the loss of somebody, and other people are showing up not to grieve, but to satisfy some sort of fascination that they have with the crime that she fell victim to, that has to just hit at a completely different level.
I agree 100%. Because they had no other leads, because there was no other evidence, law enforcement decided to do something a little less than orthodox. Law enforcement discreetly videotaped the ingress and egress of the funeral.
Is that unorthodox?
I mean, I haven't necessarily heard of other cases where this is something they did.
I think that it's not uncommon to at least get like a log of people who came to the funeral, or to have an officer in civilian clothing show
Right.
up, or to record. I have heard of that before, because in a lot of cases, the murderer will come to the funeral.
100%, especially if it's personal, especially for someone who wanted to humiliate his victim. Absolutely. I guess for me, I thought of it as being unorthodox because I really haven't seen or heard it in a lot of the true crime stuff that I've watched and seen. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. The Middletown PD hung a lot on this as being a way to find the perpetrator. And they taped the ingress and egress, and they were hoping that the killer might attend and observe the aftermath of their crime. Again, not a behavior uncommon among perpetrators of violent crimes. And then they brought in Juliana's mother, father, brother, and sister-in-law to all view this footage of the funeral, and nothing. They didn't recognize anyone as being a potential romantic or sexual partner to Juliana. They didn't see anyone that they could point to as being like a close friend or someone that they would have assumed could have committed the crime.
So she didn't have a romantic partner?
She, I assume, did, but not someone that was necessarily identified. I don't even know if Juliana knew that she was pregnant.
Well, hopefully not if she's drinking with 17-year-olds.
So
they never found a romantic partner. See, that's another disposing of... Why? Wait.
Juliana was also pregnant with her third child, so she had 2 older children.
Sure. How would the person who killed her know to slice her open and take her fetus?
We're going to get to that later. Another aspect of this situation that I found really heartbreaking is that, again, Juliana's sister-in-law, Toni, recounted this terrible and agonizing pain of having to identify Juliana's body officially. When Toni entered with her mother-in-law and her husband, the police attempted to shield the family from seeing all of the damage that had been done, all of the mutilation that had been committed. And at first, they were only shown the tattoo, which they were all able to instantly recognize. But then Toni recalled the sight of Juliana's face and how it was so decimating to her that she fell to the ground, immediately was nauseated, was so overcome with grief and pain, and that it was such a stark contrast to that, again, warm and loving individual that they had known Juliana to be.
Yeah, I think maybe that's a situation where you don't show the family the rest of the body and you say, you don't need to remember her like this.
Well, and my interpretation was that the police department tried to do that.
And they insisted.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Despite these extensive efforts, the Middletown Police Department was unable to make any progress. Again, the lack of forensic evidence or reputable and reliable eyewitness accounts grew colder by the day, and as time passed, the grim reality set in. The person responsible for the brutal murder of Juliana Frank remained at large, unseen and unsuspected. It would take over a year and another horrifying murder for investigators to realize that Juliana's death was not an isolated tragedy, but the beginning of a nightmare that would grip the Hudson Valley. 14 months had passed since the brutal killing of Juliana Frank, and the investigation into her murder, again, had grown cold. The Middletown Police Department, despite their best efforts, still had not identified any possible suspects. Residents of Middletown, who had been shaken by the gruesome nature of the crime, had begun to convince themselves that Juliana's death was either an isolated incident, this kind of freak act of violence that would not repeat itself, or that the suspect was no longer among them. However, on Friday, July 10th, 1992, this fragile and poorly conceived sense of security was shattered. The police were called to another scene of unimaginable violence.
Wait, when?
Friday, July 10th, 1992.
Am I misremembering that you said March 26th, 1991?
That's correct.
Well, how is that 14 months?
Is that not?
16 months?
Sure.
Okay.
You know I'm not mathing. You know that that's not my specialty. It's not my strong suit.
So you said bodies and you specified 14 months. So I was committing that to memory because if this is somebody who then goes on to commit a third crime, then I want to start looking at the cooling off period between the murders.
Don't worry, I'm going to give you something to look at and think about. So on July 10th,
you always do.
Around noon, a concerned neighbor entered the first floor apartment of 34-year-old Laurette Huggins Riviere? 34-year-old Laurette Huggins Riviere. That's the best I can do.
We'll take it.
After noticing her front door ajar. Inside, her neighbor discovered Laurette's lifeless body, surrounded by evidence of a violent struggle. Shaken, the neighbor immediately contacted the Middletown Police Department.
Did they ever find the location of Juliana's murder?
Nope.
Okay.
And guess what? It's never brought up. It's never revealed. I don't know if they ever even knew where she was murdered.
Well, so it's unusual to me that this woman...
We don't know these murders are connected yet, so I don't know why you're still bringing up Juliana right now.
That's right. You're going to tell me multiple successive cases that are all unrelated.
Unrelated, totally. Just all in the same location.
Okay. What is her name?
Who?
This murder victim.
Laurette.
Laurette was murdered in her own apartment.
She was.
But not dumped elsewhere. I don't know yet if the body was staged in any way. But Juliana was dumped, which makes me think that her murder probably took place at the residence of the murderer.
Okay, so again, the neighbor immediately contacts the Middletown Police Department. Laurette, a mother of 3, originally from St. Vincent in the Grenadines, was known in her community as a hardworking and devoted parent. Her life revolved around her children and her close circle of friends. Laurette had been planning to return to St. Vincent with her children, and her apartment showed signs of her preparation to move. There were several half-packed and semi-packed boxes across her apartment, and then there were actually several of those boxes that were half-packed with date stamps from just a day before. So again, Laurette worked at this kind of supermarket, and she actually had all of these boxes, like big boxes, that had been used to ship eggs. And I guess when markets receive shipments like that, they have to date stamp when they receive it on the box, or at least they did here at this business establishment. And so all of those boxes were dated for the day before her murder, or the day of her murder, actually. Detective Mark Bonnell, the first officer on the scene, noted signs of chaos in the living room: overturned furniture, items strewn across the floor, moving boxes left partially packed. Despite the evidence of a struggle, there were no signs of forced entry, leading investigators to believe that Lorette had willingly let her killer into her home. When police entered Lorette's bedroom, they were struck by the horror of what they found. Lorette's nude body lay on the floor, positioned in a way that mirrored the disturbing scene from Juliana Frank's murder. The arms, this time, however, were stretched above her head, and her legs, and I believe it was Detective Bonnell who described that Lorette's legs were as far apart split as one could possibly place them and have them remain in the same location.
Mm-hmm.
Multiple stab wounds covered Lorette's neck, her chest, and her hands bore several defensive wounds, indicating that she had fought desperately to defend herself.
It's interesting that you started this episode off by asking me about the media's portrayal of violence, because everything that you are saying to me is giving crime shows, and like everything that you're telling me, I'm like, yes, I can think of a Law and Order SVU episode that directly relates to this, or that I can directly find similarities between this and that episode. So it's interesting that the imagery that you are providing is leading me back to a TV show where they talk about, in some of the episodes, the violence that video games or the media have on individuals who then go on to commit violent crimes.
That wasn't my intention, but I'm so glad it's working out that way.
Yeah, I've got a question. I've got the same question, but twice. Where were Lorette's children? And then where were Juliana's 2 children?
Those things are never discussed in the docuseries episode, nor are they listed in any of the sources that I read.
So probably not in the apartment with Lorette.
Correct.
Okay.
The similarities between Lorette's murder and Juliana's murder were impossible to ignore. Both women had been viciously stabbed, bodies posed, and their dignity stripped away in death. Amid the chaos in the living room,
was Lorette's face also damaged to the same extent as Juliana's?
Not enough so that it was mentioned.
Okay.
Amid the chaos in the living room, Detective Warren Wagner made a crucial discovery. A single coat hanger, one of those wire coat hangers that's covered in paper, like old school dry cleaner coat hangers.
Yes.
So he discovered this coat hanger lying face down on the floor. And when he turned it over, he actually found this kind of perfect and clear bloody fingerprint. It was exactly the kind of evidence that had been missing in Juliana's case. Investigators felt a renewed sense of hope that the fingerprint could lead to the killer. However, it's important to note that in 1992, forensic analysis was still a slow and complex process, meaning it would take time to determine whether the print could be matched to a suspect.
Do you remember how long it took them in Deliana Hang's case?
I was just about to say I don't remember what case it was, but I remember you telling me that they had to go through this process of elimination to remove so many sets of fingerprints before they were even able to get to a manageable number. And that's immediately what I thought about, like when I was watching and they showed the picture of the coat hanger, because it is like a perfect print. Wow. And I was like, okay, well, they've got that, but it's fucking 1992 and it's going to take them 83 years to find a fingerprint. The brutal similarities between Lorette's murder and Juliana's caused investigators to revisit their earlier case. Again, both women had been found nude, subjected to extensive stabbing, and posed in a way that suggested their killer derived satisfaction from violence and humiliation.
Were they both the same race?
No, they were not.
Yeah.
My next line is, yet there were also notable differences.
So sorry.
1, race.
You do this to me all the time. I'm like, will you let me read my next sentence or paragraph?
Great minds think alike.
Yeah.
Additionally, Juliana's body had been discarded on railroad tracks while Lorette had been killed in her home. This led detectives to question whether the killer's confidence had grown or if Lorette's familiarity with her assailant had allowed them access to her apartment. Despite the promising discovery of the bloody fingerprint, investigators faced significant challenges. Lorette had been a loving and responsible mother with no known connections to dangerous individuals or risky behavior. Friends and family described her as someone who worked tirelessly to support her children children and prepare for her return to St. Vincent. The idea that someone would target her for such a heinous crime left everyone who knew her stunned. Lorette is kind of held up as this prototypical, does everything right kind of individual who isn't involved in any kind of behavior or activity that would make her a seeming target for this kind of crime.
But she works retail?
Yes.
At a grocery store.
From my understanding.
Okay, well, you know what? Criminals across the board, regardless of the crime, embezzlement, murder, whatever, everybody eats. Everybody goes to the grocery store. And then she's also in the process of moving. So now we're looking at movers or people who would be coming to the apartment to do a walkthrough or anything like that. I mean, yeah, she didn't live a life that was considered high risk, but in the place that she was in her life and in the job that she did, she would have come across people who would maybe be violent that wouldn't have been in her daily life.
Absolutely.
And it doesn't sound like this crime was quite as personal. So it would surprise me if this was somebody who she knew well who killed her.
The lack of immediate suspects left the police with few options other than to canvass Lorette's neighborhood, question her acquaintances, and search for any signs of suspicious activity. While forensic analysis of the fingerprint moved forward, investigators began examining possible connections between Lorette's murder and Juliana's. However, the long gap between the two killings, 14 months, 16 months,
jury's out,
was puzzling. Detectives wondered why the killer would have waited so long to strike again. Unbeknownst to investigators at the time, the gap in killings was no coincidence.
Oh.
I'm breadcrumbing for you. Do you like it?
Yeah, no coincidence.
The murder of Lorette sent shockwaves through Middletown, reigniting the fear and dread that had begun to fade after Juliana's case had gone cold. Former LAPD investigator Tracy Benjamin later remarked that the deliberate posing of Lorette's body reflected the psychological profile, again, of a killer who sought to humiliate and degrade their victims, deriving a twisted sense of control and satisfaction from their deeds.
And he hates women, if that wasn't already understood.
If you weren't for sure. As the Middletown Police Department struggled to make progress, the community became increasingly uneasy. I can't imagine why. Residents couldn't help but wonder if a serial killer might be preying on women in their town. Again, at this point, we're talking 2 murders.
Yeah, it can't be serial killer unless there are 3.
Despite the mounting fear, detectives remained focused on processing the fingerprint evidence and piecing together any connections between the 2 murders that they could. But just as investigators began to grapple with the implication of Lorette's death, another devastating event occurred. 10 days later, 2 cousins disappeared after a night out in nearby Poughkeepsie, setting off a chain of events that would ultimately expose the true scope of the killer's spree. So now in Poughkeepsie, 30 miles from Middletown, on the night of July 20th, 1992, 2 cousins, 23-year-old Angelina Hopkins and 20-year-old Brenda Whiteside, decided to spend an evening out at the Blue Note Tavern, a popular local bar. According to friends and other patrons, the cousins were seen dancing, laughing, enjoying themselves. But as the night wore on, they left with an unidentified man driving a pickup truck, and neither woman was seen alive again. Now, here, I already told you before I got here today that there were some discrepancies in reporting, and I do want to point out that in some sources, it's argued that these 2 cousins disappeared with 4 men, that they left with 4 men and the 2 of them. Now, I only saw that in one source, so I'm going to take that to be unsubstantiated and instead run with what seems to be the more common version, which is they left with a singular man. When Angelina and Brenda failed to return home the next morning, their family grew concerned. Angelina's mother, Anna Hopkins, and her sister Cecilia quickly filed missing persons reports. However, the descriptions of the man seen with the cousins and the pickup truck were vague, providing little for police to pursue. The investigation stalled almost immediately. As law enforcement struggled to develop concrete leads, Captain Donald Briggs later described the area around the Blue Note Tavern as a rough neighborhood, riddled with vacant lots and frequent illicit illicit activity. The distrust between locals and law enforcement compounded the difficulty of gathering information. Frustrated by the lack of progress, Anna Hopkins and Cecilia decided to take matters into their own hands. They returned to the Blue Note Tavern night after night, questioning patrons and piecing together any information they could find about the man their relatives had left with. Despite the challenges, their determination eventually began to yield results. They collected fragments of details, nicknames, physical descriptions, and even partial license plate numbers. These leads, while incomplete, pointed them closer to identifying the man responsible for their loved one's disappearance. Their relentless investigation came to a pivotal moment on August 2nd, 1992. Nearly 2 weeks after Angelina and Brenda had vanished, a friend of Anna's called to inform her that the same man who had left the bar with her daughter and niece was back at the Blue Note Tavern. Acting quickly, Anna and Cecilia rushed to the scene and contacted a local officer for backup. By the time they had arrived, the man, later identified as Nathaniel White, was still at the bar. I have to tell you that the work that Anna and Cecilia did was so impressive. This investigative work they did when the police, and to be fair, accounts of what occurred during this time, especially related to the Blue Note Tavern, sometimes paints the police in a negative light, as if they didn't put much effort into actually searching for these two young women, but also that it was very difficult to get any concrete information. So it sounds like either way, it was very difficult.
So it can be really easy to come down hard on the police, and sometimes it's deserved. But you also have to remember that they work in shifts and they are dealing with all of the crime in the area. They do not, and they probably, in a town that's 25,000, don't have enough of them to have a couple of officers or detectives or anybody who can just solely focus on this one report of the two women who have gone missing. So their families have more time available to focus solely on this one case because they're doing it in an unofficial capacity.
And they did. And they worked hard on this. So hard, in fact, that the New York Times actually published an article about these two women titled Relatives Cracked Serial Killing Case.
Okay.
Not to give away too much at the beginning, but we are talking about a serial killer at this point.
Well, which means that these two women, at least one of them, but probably both of them, are deceased. But we'll get there. We'll find out. I'll find out soon.
Yeah, you will. Sorry, I
But
thought you meant the women who were investigating on behalf of their family members. And I was like, why do they have to be dead?
No.
But now I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, and because you have to have 3... We'll get to
it.
Yeah.
So... Cecilia and her sister actually confronted this man at the Blue Note Tavern. And I misspoke earlier. The police were not there. It was Cecilia and her sister, or Anna and her sister, Cecilia.
You said they called for backup.
Oh, that's right. And they actually approached Nathaniel White, this man who was supposedly the last person seen with their daughters. And he said that he had only met them and that his only interaction with them was giving them a ride down to the train station down the street. So he hadn't really done anything with them other than drive them down the street and drop them off. And at that point, he hops in his truck, drives away, and Anna is fast enough that she actually writes down his license plate number as she sees him leaving and turns that over to authorities once they get there. And when authorities run that license plate, they see that it is in fact connected to Nathaniel White, the person who is reported to have seen them last. A background check revealed a troubling criminal history to the Poughkeepsie Police Department when running their check. White had previous convictions for robbery and for abducting a 16-year-old girl at knife point. He had actually been released on parole in April of 1992, just months before the disappearance of Angelina and Brenda.
When was he incarcerated?
Well, Nathaniel White actually was incarcerated the first time and then was released in 1991 and was free for a few months before he abducted a 16-year-old girl at knife point and broke the conditions of his parole and was put back in prison until mid-1992 when he was released again.
When was this incident with the 16-year-old girl at knife point?
Sometime in mid to late 1991.
So he was free in March of 1991 is what you're saying to
I
me?
believe so.
And then he was locked up until right before July 1992 is also what you're saying to me?
That is correct.
Got it.
Are we putting puzzle pieces together?
It actually feels more like you have given me one of those like connect the dots sheets, but like that's for a 7-year-old. I'm picking up what you're putting down.
Good, good. The police are starting to pick up what's been putting down too. Putting down.
Yeah, well,
What's been put down? Oh, God.
I think, you probably have the benefit of them having done all of the work and you're just retelling it.
Meanwhile, in Middletown, investigators were still kind of combing over the similarities between Juliana Frank and Lorette Huggins Revere. That discovery of the fingerprint had provided hope, but they still had no official results forensically related to the fingerprint. The Poughkeepsie police began sharing information about Angelina and Brenda's case with Middletown authorities. But at this stage, the potential connection between the missing cousins and the earlier murders was purely speculative. And the way this information even got shared is that a representative from the Poughkeepsie Police Department was in the Middleton Police Department to share information about these two missing women. As police in Poughkeepsie and Middletown struggled to make sense of this growing pattern, Anna Hopkins and Cecilia refused to back down, and their grassroots investigation continued, driven by a deep conviction that Nathaniel White knew more than he was admitting. The urgency surrounding the cousins' case only intensified on July 30th, 1992, when another body was discovered just 8 miles from Middletown near a town called Goshen. A man walking his dog came across
That's me.
Came across a woman's nude body on a dirt driveway leading to an abandoned restaurant. The victim was later identified as 27-year-old Adrienne Hunter, and her murder bore eerie similarities to the killings of Juliana and Lorette. Like the earlier victims, Adrienne had been stabbed repeatedly, exactly 47 times, according to the medical examiner, and her body had been posed in a deliberate and degrading manner. The discovery of Adrienne's body further heightened fears that a serial killer might be preying on women in the Hudson Valley. Law enforcement across multiple jurisdictions began to collaborate more closely, sharing details about the victims and potential suspects. At this point, I believe the state police had become heavily involved in what was going on between all of the cases. At this point, the parallels that existed between the cases were becoming undeniable. All found nude, posed, and subjected to excessive violence or overkill. Finally, on August 4th, 1992, just days after the discovery of Adrienne's body, Nathaniel White was brought in for questioning. This marked the beginning of the unraveling of one of the most horrifying crime sprees this region has ever seen. Despite this emerging picture, investigators still lacked direct evidence connecting White to any of these crimes. Law enforcement organized...
Fingerprint?
Well, and that's weird because he definitely would have had a fingerprint. Right? At this point, when they really start considering Nathaniel White, things are moving very fast. We have really started to escalate in the speed of how quickly the police department is trying to operate, or these joint police departments. So law enforcement organized 3 teams to monitor White's residence, his known hangouts, and the areas where the women had disappeared. On August 2nd, 1992, this strategy and patience paid off. Initially, one of the teams approached Nathaniel White's residence, knocked on the door several times, and they got no response. Nathaniel White did not come to the door. So that specific team moved down the street, and very shortly afterwards, Nathaniel White left with his girlfriend, Jill Garrison. And police followed, I think, for a very brief time and pulled him over, and had already kind of created this pretext for his being stopped, which was a stolen license plate on his vehicle. And that is how they eventually arrested him and took him in for questioning.
Did he have stolen plates on his vehicle?
I believe he did at this point.
Okay.
Yeah. It was a pretext, but it was true.
I was like, I don't think that we can do that. I don't think that we can make it up if it's not true, but okay. I was hoping.
Yes. White was detained and brought to New York State Police Troop F headquarters in Wallkill, Orange County for questioning. Detectives began their interrogation carefully, focusing initially on the disappearance of Angelina and Brenda. White denied any involvement, claiming that he had given the cousins a ride and dropped them off near a train station. He also downplayed his connection to Lorette, describing himself as merely an acquaintance who had occasionally helped her pack boxes in preparation for her move.
Mm-hmm.
I want to point out at this point
that I said that as a possible theory. Thank you. I appreciate when you recognize that I do get it right occasionally.
Yes, you do. More than occasionally.
Mm-mm.
Lorette not only knew Nathaniel White, but they were darn near close to being neighbors. Very close neighbors.
Not darn near.
And furthermore, Jill Garrison, Nathaniel White's girlfriend, was actually very close friends with Lorette. So close, in fact, that Lorette's daughters had stayed the night with Jill Garrison and Nathaniel White only weeks before Lorette's murder. With no physical evidence to link White to the crimes at this point, detectives knew that they were running out of time to hold him. And when the detectives kind of look back at this interrogation, they really emphasized that Nathaniel White was almost impossibly calm. Everything about him was very collected, very cool, very calm. And because they knew that they were running out of time, they had to do some kind of Hail Mary. So this is when state police investigator Jim McCoy is brought in. He gets a call, I believe, in the middle of the night. It's like 1:30 a.m. And they say, hey, will you come in and give Nathaniel White a polygraph test if he's willing to agree? And believe it or not, Nathaniel White decided to waive his Miranda rights, his right to an attorney, and agreed to a polygraph test.
At what point are they going to test the fingerprint?
Cameron, I don't know. You're going to have to let that ghost go. I don't know if that ever even comes back up. I know. Well, and the thing is,
I am gobsmacked.
So during the polygraph,
we're going to polygraph. You can't fucking use a polygraph in a court of law, but you know what you can use?
A fingerprint?
A fingerprint in the victim's blood at the scene of a bloody murder.
Well,
because you can't say, well, no, my fingerprint was there before. We're friends. Her kids come stay at my house. Did they find the cousins? Did I miss that?
Nope. During the polygraph, McCoy began by asking questions about our missing cousins. And at this point in time, Nathaniel White starts to change his story just a little bit.
Just enough.
So he says that the cousins, well, maybe he had some, like, they had drank together, maybe done some drugs together, maybe even had sexual intercourse together, but that was really...
It's hard to remember those things. Maybe. We maybe did drugs and banged.
And during the polygraph, McCoy then moved to asking questions about Lorette and whether or not Nathaniel White knew her, how they knew each other. And Nathaniel White says, you know what? I guess I actually did see her about 3 days before her death. On July 7th, she had asked for a little help, said, can you help me pack? And being the great friend and man that I am, I went over and helped her pack boxes.
And she cut herself, and then I dipped my thumb in it and touched a hanger, but everybody ignore that. That's irrelevant. Let's see what this little...
Well, and detectives were skeptical because from everything they remembered about the crime scene and what they knew, there was no way those boxes had been packed on July 7th.
No, they were stamped from the date of her murder.
They were stamped from the date of her murder.
Is there a parrot?
Meaning that those boxes, this incident, him being there to help her, could have only happened on that day. And would you believe Nathaniel White was oh, maybe it was that day. Maybe it was on that day.
And there was this masked guy who was coming in as I was going, and I was like, hey, man.
Well, and then investigator McCoy says, okay, sure, maybe. We all get confused. But what about the bloody fingerprint on the coat hanger?
But what about when you murdered her before you left?
And when McCoy poses this question about the bloody fingerprint that you have been on like a rabid dog.
Rabid? Rabid?
Nathaniel White.
Why do I have to have rabies?
He changes his story one more time and says, okay, you got me. I killed Lorette. I killed her. That bloody fingerprint, it belongs to me. I killed her. According to White's confession.
What in the butt fuck is happening?
According to White's confession, he had visited Lorette on the day of her murder and the two had sex.
Sure.
But an argument quickly escalated into violence.
But it happened all the time.
And White claimed that Lorette cut him first, prompting him to retaliate by grabbing a pair of scissors and repeatedly stabbing her. He described dragging her body to the bedroom.
Had she been stabbed with scissors or a knife?
Scissors.
And they had held that detail back?
I think so.
Well, sorry, buddy. You're about to go down for all of these murders now.
Body to the bedroom floor and posed her, and he was inspired by a scene from a vampire movie he had seen.
Oh, this makes sense.
Forensic psychologist Dr. Kate Termini later noted that this act of posing the body reflected White's desire to shock and degrade, ensuring that whoever found the body would feel an additional layer of horror. Encouraged by this breakthrough, McCoy shifted his focus once again, this time to Adrian Hunter, whose body had been discovered just days earlier. At first, White denied any involvement, but as detectives continued to press him, he eventually confessed. He claimed that he had spotted Adrian walking in Middletown near, what is the word?
The tavern.
Some kind of like geographical, like a bay, maybe?
The banks.
The banks! That's exactly the word I was looking for. Along a bank.
The bank of the Hudson.
Yes! Oh my God, you're such a genius.
I am okay.
So,
all right.
Well, I forgot the word. It is bank, along the bank, and offered her a ride. The two drove to a secluded location, and he was like, "Hey, if you come with me, we can do drugs and have sex
and canoodle.
Yeah. I'll get you high, and we'll bone." And supposedly, Adrian went along with this. According to Nathaniel White,
people often see you and they approach you and they're like, "Hey, I've got some drugs and some D.
I'll get you high as fuck and then give it to you good."
And that is what D&D stands for.
White alleged that after they finished having
D&D,
sex,
right?
That Adrian decided that she asked or needed or wanted money, and White just became enraged at this proposition.
Yeah, he was not paying for sex.
From what I understand, White hit Adrian a number of times, went to her side of the car, pulled her out, and continued to hit her until she lost consciousness. Then White retrieved a 10-inch butcher knife from his car and stabbed Adrian 47 times across her torso and back.
What do you do with the butcher knives that you keep in your car as you drive around?
I hope to find a good meat sale.
Not menace. Roadkill. Obviously it's disgusting when a murderer is like, "Oh, this person, they wanted D&D and they wanted money and blah, blah, blah." And I'm like, you're clearly just disgracing their name. And I can almost guarantee that at least 75% of that is untrue. At least.
I also want to note that one of the things that was really effective in getting Nathaniel White to confess to the murder of Angelina Hopkins and Brenda Whiteside, the cousins, was McCoy kind of using an emotional appeal. I forgot to include this earlier, but he actually spoke about how hard their mothers, their families had been searching for them, everything they had went to, how desperate they were for answers. And this is what ultimately led to White confessing to killing both women. And in his explanation of what occurred, he stated that he had driven the cousins to a remote area off a street called Harriman Drive. And once there to this kind of wooded area, he asked Angelina to go with him into the woods. And Angelina goes with him into the woods. And at some point, she is in front of him and he has collected this blunt piece of metal, a blunt metal object. I don't know what it is exactly. They don't disclose, but that he hit her once across the back of the head and instantly knocked her out. He then returned to the vehicle and shared with Brenda that her cousin needed her and that he needed her to go with her back into the woods to go get Angelina. Once back into the woods, Nathaniel retrieved the blunt metal object again and struck struck Brenda across the back of the head. By Nathaniel White's own confession, he killed both women by alternating between hitting the two of them in the back of the head over and over and over until he could no longer physically lift the weapon. White then offered to lead investigators to the location where he had disposed of the cousins' bodies. On August 4th, 1992, Nathaniel White took police to a heavily wooded area off of Harriman Drive. There, detectives made a startling discovery. Not only did they find the remains of Angelina and Brenda, but they also uncovered a third set of remains. The additional victim was identified as 14-year-old Christine Klebe. Christine Klebe was the niece of White's then girlfriend, Jill Garrison. Christine Klebe had been missing since June 1992, and her family did not report her missing until July 1st, 1992. White admitted to luring Christine Klebe to the woods under the pretense of buying her beer and getting her drunk, and took her out into the woods and ended up murdering her there. He didn't offer a lot of specifics about the murder of Christine Klebe like he did with the others, but it is the one instance where he expressed deep remorse that he felt like he had hurt his family by killing Christine Klebe.
It's baffling me that they were able to manipulate him with emotions by making him feel guilty or making him feel empathy or making him feel like all of that. I'm so confused by him.
With that, Nathaniel White had admitted to 2 different unsolved murders, as well as 2 missing persons cases and their subsequent murders. His final confession helped authorities
3 missing persons cases. Unless the cousins are considered 1.
2.
But then his girlfriend's niece?
Oh, that's correct. Yes, my apologies. Then, of his own volition, Nathaniel White admitted that the first person he ever killed was Juliana Frank. His final confession helped authorities finally place all of the dates of each case. Nathaniel White had been locked up in April of 1991 and remained there through April of 1992. In between the Juliana Frank murder and the Lorette Huggins murder, White was in jail where he was unable to kill anyone, explaining the break and murders. Beth Karras, that former New York City prosecutor, offered that Nathaniel's time in prison following his first murder likely emboldened him, making him feel as if he was uncatchable. Ultimately, it's believed that Nathaniel's time in prison served as kind of this pressure cooker, pushing him further towards his desire to kill again. Nathaniel White shared that he had seen Juliana Frank walking on North Street in Middletown. They drove down by the railroad tracks and were drinking together. Nathaniel stated that he and Juliana engaged in consensual sex acts, and shortly following, Juliana had asked for money. Are you seeing a recurring theme in how he says each of these incidents built? Again, this desire for money after sex enraged and infuriated Nathaniel. Following this request, Nathaniel punched Juliana several times, causing her to fall. He then stabbed her multiple times and cut open her belly. Nathaniel shares that he did not realize that Juliana was pregnant when he killed her, and subsequently opened her abdominal cavity.
He didn't know, but that's the only victim that he opened the abdominal cavity of.
So, your question brings us back to my initial question, which was, how does the media shape how we think about violence? Nathaniel White did not know that Juliana was pregnant, but he had recently seen a movie, RoboCop 2, where someone was sliced from their neck to their lower abdomen, which he said is what encouraged him to slice open Juliana.
So was each murder just inspired by a different movie or form of entertainment? Or, I mean, literally, there's nothing here that is really adding up 100% for me.
His first 2 murders absolutely had some inspiration from film. He tells us that Juliana Frank, that large incision and like removing the fetus was something that he had seen in RoboCop 2. And I believe in that film, the person is disemboweled versus having a fetus removed. And that Lorette Huggins was posed that way because of what he had seen in a vampire movie. We don't get any other kind of explicit connections to media for the other 4 murders. By the end of the interrogation, White had confessed to the killing of Juliana Frank in March of 1991, who he stabbed over 40 times, disemboweled, removed the fetus of her unborn child, and was left on railroad tracks. Second, Lorette Huggins Revere.
You said in June of 1992 was when he
Oh, I
killed.
apologize. I have it listed here and like in order of when I discovered about them.
Fair.
Yeah. So Christine Klebe, late June 1992, the 14-year-old niece of White's girlfriend, killed and left near the same wooded area as Angelina Hopkins and Brenda Whiteside. Lorette Huggins Revere, stabbed and posed in her Middletown apartment. Adrienne Hunter, stabbed 47 times and left near an abandoned restaurant. And then Angelina Hopkins and Brenda Whiteside on July 20th, 1992, bludgeoned to death in the woods off of Harriman Drive. With the confessions and the discovery of the victims' remains, law enforcement finally had the evidence they needed to charge White. However, as the news of his arrest and crime spread, it ignited a firestorm of outrage and grief, as well as a broader debate about the parole system that had allowed him to walk free. In the days following Nathaniel White's confessions, law enforcement scrambled to compile the evidence needed to formally charge him with multiple counts of murders. The discoveries in the wooded area off of Harriman Drive, where the remains of Angelina Hopkins, Brenda Whiteside, and 14-year-old Kristen Klebe were found, solidified his culpability. Additionally, Juliana Frank, Lorette Huggins Revere, and Adrienne Hunter's remains and crime scenes were also used as evidence. By early August 1992, police and prosecutors were prepared to proceed with what was shaping up to be one of the most horrifying murder cases in Hudson Valley history. On August 7th, 1992, Nathaniel White was indicted for the murder of Christine Klebe. A month later, on September 9th, 1992, a grand jury added 5 more counts of second-degree murder, bringing the total to 6 charges. Each murder, gruesome in its details, underscored White's disturbing capacity for violence and his predatory tendencies. White pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, claiming that he was driven to kill by the violent imagery from movies like RoboCop 2, as well as the, quote, voices in his head. Nathaniel White was actually interviewed by a news media outlet while he was in jail, and he speaks to the fact that these different voices told him to kill, to disembowel, to harm these different women. The relatives...
Why is it second-degree murder?
I don't know.
You cannot convince me that he did not have any premeditation taking those 2 cousins to the same location where he had already killed another person, a teenage girl.
She had just finished 8th grade that year.
Yeah, she was 14. And then, what, a month? I guess a month and a half, right? Because it was about a month later that he killed Lorette. And then 10 days after that, the cousins go missing. So 6 weeks after the fact, he takes them back there. That was not coincidental. It's not just because he felt comfortable there. That was premeditated.
Right.
IMO. Okay, sure. Second-degree murder.
The relatives of White's victims were devastated by the loss of their loved ones, but absolutely resolute in their demand for justice. Christopher Garrison, the father of 14-year-old Christine Klebe, publicly denounced White's insanity defense. Garrison argued that White was no madman, but rather a calculated predator who murdered Christine to silence her. He believed that Christine, who had potentially reportedly been sexually abused by White, had killed her to prevent her from speaking out. Anna Hopkins, the mother of Angelina Hopkins, echoed this frustration. She expressed anger at the parole system, stating that if White had been properly monitored or sentenced more harshly for his prior crimes, her daughter and niece might still be alive. Other family members shared similar sentiments, their grief compounded by the knowledge that White had been released on parole not once, but twice before his killing spree resumed. Nathaniel White's trial began in April of 1993 and drew significant media attention, both for the horrific nature of his crimes and for the broader implications surrounding his parole. The prosecution presented a meticulous case, calling over 70 witnesses to testify. These included detectives who had taken White's confessions, forensics experts who analyzed the crime scenes, and family members who had described the emotional toll of losing their loved ones. The prosecution relied heavily on White's detailed confessions, in which he calmly described each murder with chilling precision. They argued that his actions, carefully posing the victims, disposing of their bodies in remote locations, and attempting to clean away evidence, demonstrated clear intent and deliberation. These were not the actions of someone driven by uncontrollable voices or delusions, but rather of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. White's defense, however, remained centered on his claims of insanity. His attorney, Bernard Brady, argued that White had been influenced by violent media and plagued by auditory hallucinations that compelled him to kill. White himself claimed that a specific scene from RoboCop 2, in which a character is disemboweled, had inspired him during the murder of Juliana Frank. However, the prosecution countered that White's efforts to conceal his crimes and manipulate his victims were inconsistent with the behavior of someone who lacked control or understanding of their actions. The jury needed little time to deliberate, and on April 14, 1993, Nathaniel White was found guilty on all 6 counts of second-degree murder. Judge Jeffrey Berry presided over the sentencing, which took place on May 27, 1993, and Berry handed down 6 consecutive sentences of 25 years to life, amounting to a total of 150 years to life in prison. This ensured that White would never again walk free. That is kind of where our story of this terrible Hudson Valley serial murderer ends, but it's not necessarily where our entire story ends. White's case ignited a firestorm of criticism against the parole system in New York State. He had committed his first murder, the killing of Juliana Frank, in March 1991, shortly before being arrested for the abduction of a 16-year-old girl. Despite the violent nature of that crime, White was sentenced to a relatively short prison term and released on parole in April 1992, and within 3 months, he resumed killing, targeting Lorette Huggins, Adrienne Hunter, Angelina Hopkins, Brenda Whiteside, and Christine Klebe. The revelation that White had been paroled not once but twice, despite a clear pattern of violent behavior, outraged both the public and lawmakers. Then Governor George Pataki cited White's crimes in his campaign to reinstate the death penalty in New York, arguing that individuals capable of such heinous acts should never have the opportunity for parole. Critics of the parole system questioned why White's earlier abduction case had not resulted in a harsher sentence, while others pointed to systemic flaws in evaluating the risk posed by violent offenders. This became such a big flashpoint for the parole system in New York that the New York Times ended up publishing this kind of editorial piece called Don't Blame Parole, and kind of was built around this case. David Ernst, a spokesperson for the state division of parole, defended the decision to release White, stating that he had met all the criteria for parole and displayed no, quote, red flags while incarcerated. However, for the families of the victims, this explanation did little to address their pain or the loss of their loved ones.
Yeah.
Additionally, the severity of the crimes committed by Nathaniel White, particularly the disembowelment and removal of Juliana Frank's fetus, were seared into the public consciousness, so much so that Twisted Killers, which is where I primarily took a lot of my case from, is not the only program to feature these set of crimes. Evil Lives Here also chronicled White's actions. They've been written about several times.
Have you ever watched Evil Lives Here?
No. Is it good?
It's pretty good. The intro music is like way creepy.
Ominous music, creepy music really puts me on edge.
It does a very good job. I think that even people who don't get easily put on edge would be put on edge by that music. Skip intro is my suggestion.
Okay, good to know. And the last thing I wanted to kind of discuss before we officially wrap is that this case is complicated in the way that there's a forced timeout for the perpetrator. And I was hoping that you could maybe help me understand a little bit better.
So he didn't kill while he was in prison because of the imprisonment and
because
how
of
it
his
is designed.
Incarceration.
It is designed to keep him from having access to the public, where in which he would do his killing.
So
Elucidated.
does this constitute as a serial killer, a spree killer? Is he both? Does he meet the criteria for both?
So typically with a serial killer, you'd have to have a minimum of 3 murders that have a cooling off period. And as time goes on, that cooling off period tends to shrink. It's hard to know because of the 16-month incarceration when he would have killed again, because it all seems like it was in very close succession, right? 5 of the 6 murders that he committed were between the beginning of June 1992 and the beginning of August 1992. But it's hard to really know because I am not technically a trained professional on that.
Yeah.
But also because of that 16 months where he was locked up.
And I think he was only locked up for 12, April to April.
You did say that.
Well, we've also had lots of discussion about months and times in this episode because what if I am not bad at math?
So whatever, the 12 months though, he didn't kill anybody during that 12 months. Did he not do anything between his release in April of 1992 and then June?
Nothing that's reported, but I do think from what I read, you're spot on with what I have seen other criminologists comment, which is that it's both. It's serial and it's spree. And, you know, like you were saying, the cooling off period continues to dwindle and they kind of begin to move more frantically.
Which is what you said earlier, him sitting in prison. Yes, he was incarcerated, but not for like the higher penalty crime of murder because they hadn't linked him to that murder. So he had this sense of bravado that he nurtured for his duration of incarceration. And so I think that is also an explanation for, because you don't take 2 people to kill unless you've got a lot of confidence that you're going to be able to do it and get away with it.
Right.
And I feel like it also speaks to that point that you made earlier.
Well, and that's kind of where I was headed next in terms of, because some of what he did was so methodical, so thought out, so ritualistic, so posed, that's more in line with what we see as a serial killer.
It feels like the methodical part was what he did with the bodies after he had already killed the women or the girls, whichever the case may be.
The innocent victims.
Right. But the causes of death don't feel like they're that methodical. The only thing that's methodical about it is the overkill in every case, or was...
It was overkill in every case.
Even in Christine?
Well, that's what we know the least about.
Got it.
He seemed to display a level of shame and regret over killing Christine Klebe.
And her body was out in the middle of summer months.
Yes.
In a wooded area. So bugs and animals and the heat all caused decomposition. I guess you would know though, because I'm sure that if he did kill the 2 cousins the way that he said, by beating them repeatedly in the back of the head, you would be able to see that in Christine's skull. Like there would be some indication on her bones.
Right.
If it was anything that was that traumatic. Not necessarily with a knife wound after the body's decomposed, unless they...
hit bone.
So...
that's all I've got for you.
Okay, well, this guy, hot take, sucks.
Very hot take.
Yeah.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, 0 out of 10 for him. But I did appreciate the case that you brought and the way that you told it.
Good.
I enjoyed that. But
I tried to make it enjoyable for you.
Thank you so much.
That was
finally.
my goal.
My God.
Finally, I know. I'm a very selfish podcaster, but I tried to tell it in a way that you would enjoy.
Yeah. Well, and that is going to speak to me solving this thing because, it has maybe been mentioned before, but it's kind of a compulsion for me too.
I know. I live it. I see it. I podcast with it.
Lucky. Quit bragging.
How much more fortunate could you be?
Yeah, I'm kind of baffled by this guy because, it sounds like me and the experts are on the same page on this one.
Always.
Yeah.
And it's always you and the experts. In total agreement.
No.
Especially when it comes to legs, gait, posture.
Okay. I didn't need this today. Just sitting here trying to enjoy my afternoon. But he's kind of all over the map when it comes to how to classify him, his victimology, his motive, his means of killing. Like, it's a little bit everywhere. And so I'm kind of thrown off by him.
Yeah.
But I appreciate you sharing the story of these women and young girls. And just for the record, fuck Nathaniel White.
Yeah, well said, and you're welcome.
A complete list of sources and any links can be found in the show notes.
And that's all we've got for this episode. If you enjoyed listening and want to hear more, subscribe, give us a 5-star rating, and leave a review.
Recommend us to a friend.
And make sure you're following us at End of Crime Pod on Instagram.
Our email address is endofcrimepod@gmail.com, so feel free to reach out with questions or episode suggestions.
Thank you for listening.
Until the next crime.